The first fracture in my marriage appeared on a rain-slicked Thursday afternoon. I remember the exact moment because it smelled like iron, the metallic tang of impending storms mixing with the acrid coffee Claire had left brewing too long. She'd forgotten her phone on the kitchen counter, something she never did. The screen lit up as I passed, a notification from an app one didn't recognize. Your 2:15 reservation at the Grove is confirmed. The Grove was a boutique hotel, downtown, all velvet curtains and $300 tasting menus. We hadn't been there in years. Claire's schedule had been erratic for months. Late nights she blamed on quarterly audits, weekend conferences in cities I'd never heard her mention before. At first, I attributed it to ambition. She'd always been career-driven, climbing the ladder at her PR firm with a smile that could disarm CEOs. But ambition doesn't leave traces of bergamot and sandalwood on collar linings, scents foreign to her vanity. Ambition doesn't erase the softness in a voice when someone asks, "How was your day?" I began cataloging the anomalies. The way she'd angle her phone screen away when I entered the room. The sudden interest in yoga classes that ran 3 hours every Tuesday and Thursday. The receipts I found crumpled in her coat pocket, parking validations from a garage 3 blocks from her office, time-stamped during hours she claimed to be in meetings. I mapped her contradictions like a cartographer tracing fault lines, each discovery a tremor beneath the surface of our polished life. One evening I followed her. Not out of suspicion, but desperation, a need to prove myself paranoid. She'd worn a crimson dress I'd never seen, the fabric clinging to her in a way that felt deliberate. The taxi took her to a brownstone in the West End, a neighborhood of art galleries and overpriced lofts. Through the frosted glass of a third-floor window, I watched silhouettes merge. A man's hand, broad and ringless, brushing hair from her face. Her laugh, muffled but unmistakable, carried through the cracked pane. I stood there until rain soaked through my shoes, the cold seeping into bones I no longer recognized as my own. The next morning, I hired a man named Victor. He specialized in corporate espionage, a term that felt absurd until he slid a manila envelope across my desk a week later. Inside were photographs, Claire entering a luxury apartment building, her keycard flashing against the scanner. Security footage of her and a man, early 40s salt and pepper hair, tailored suits, riding elevators with the ease of habit. Credit card statements showed dinners at Le Marais, jewelry purchases from boutiques she'd never worn for me. Victor's report was clinical, merciless. Affair duration, 11 months. Frequency, 2 to 3 weekly encounters. Subject's identity, Marcus Renly, CFO of her firm. Married. 2 children. I spent nights cross-referencing dates. Our anniversary dinner, where she'd excused herself to take a client call, coincided with a $1,200 charge at a ski lodge in Vermont. The weekend she'd claimed to visit her sick mother in Albany, flight records placed her in Barbados. Each lie was a surgical strike, precise and bloodless. I began to see her differently, not as the woman who'd laughed at my terrible puns over burnt pancakes, but as a strategist. A war general in Prada heels. The betrayal should have broken me. Instead, it sharpened me. I started with small revenges, invisible adjustments to her routine. A drop of hot sauce in her almond milk latte, just enough to sour the sweetness. Misdirected emails that slipped her client pitches into competitors' inboxes. She'd come home flustered, complaining about incompetent interns, and I'd nod sympathetically while tracing the faint bruise on her wrist, a mark that didn't match my hands. But these were petty strikes. I wanted collapse. I wanted her to feel the ground vanish the way I had that night in the rain. So I began drafting a blueprint, not of anger but precision. Her world was built on secrets. I'd make them currency. I copied keys, cloned her phone, embedded tracking software in her laptop. Every deleted text, every encrypted email, every whispered promise to Marcus became data points in a ledger only I could see. By the time I discovered the offshore account, a numbered vault in the Caymans funneling embezzled funds from her firm, I realized Claire had given me more than revenge. She'd handed me a detonator. All I had to do was wait for the perfect moment to press it. The blueprint for collapse required patience. I spent weeks mirroring Claire's routines, syncing my movements to hers like a shadow. Mondays, she met Marcus at the Carlton Suites, room 814, 12:30 p.m. sharp. Tuesdays, yoga at Zenith Studio, though her mat remained rolled in the trunk of her Lexus. Thursdays, client dinners that bled into mornings. I documented it all, not with the rage of a scorned husband, but the precision of an archivist preserving evidence of a dying civilization. The offshore account became my fulcrum. Claire had funneled $2.3 million from her firm's charitable foundation into a shell company named Veritas Holdings. Marcus's signature appeared on every transfer, his looping cursive betraying none of the guilt that should have accompanied such theft. I traced the money through a labyrinth of dummy corporations, each layer peeling back to reveal deeper rot. By the time the funds reached the Caymans, they'd been laundered through art auctions, a Basquiat replica here, a Warhol print there. The irony wasn't lost on me. Claire had built her career on curating authenticity. Her undoing would be built on forgeries. I began with Marcus's wife. Lydia Renly was a woman of calculated poise, her Instagram a mosaic of charity galas and sunlit family portraits. To her, image was scripture. I created an anonymous email account attaching scanned invoices from Veritas Holdings alongside photos of Claire and Marcus exiting the Carlton. The subject line, "Ask your husband about the Basquiat." Lydia's response took 37 minutes, a forwarded thread to Marcus's corporate email, carbon copied to the firm's ethics committee. By noon, Marcus was placed on administrative leave. Claire's panic was subtle but unmistakable. She took up smoking again, the cherry of her cigarette trembling in the dark as she paced the backyard. I watched from the study, sipping bourbon, as she scrolled through her phone. Marcus's number blocked, his texts unanswered. Her hands, once steady enough to apply eyeliner in moving cars, now fumbled with lighters. I escalated. Using a burner phone, I posed as a journalist from the Financial Chronicle, tipping off their investigative team about discrepancies in the Foundation's books. Within days, subpoenas arrived. Claire's office was raided at dawn, agents carting out hard drives in sealed evidence bags. She came home that evening, her blouse wrinkled, mascara smudged. "It's a misunderstanding," she said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. I nodded, handing her a glass of wine laced with Xanax. She drank it greedily. The next phase required finesse. Claire kept a second phone buried in her lingerie drawer, encrypted and biometric locked. While she slept, I pressed her thumb to the sensor, the screen glowing green. The messages were poetic in their carelessness, Marcus begging her to flee, to drain the accounts and disappear. "We can start over," he wrote. "Somewhere they'll never find us." Claire's response, "Not yet." I rewrote their narrative. Using AI voice cloning software, I fabricated a call between Marcus and a buyer in Dubai negotiating the sale of stolen art. The audio file, paired with falsified wire transfer records, found its way to the SEC. Marcus was arrested at JFK, his carry-on stuffed with $500,000 in cash, a prop planted by a contact I'd paid in Bitcoin. The news cycle exploded. Claire's firm distanced itself, issuing statements about zero tolerance for misconduct. Her name trended on Twitter, strangers dissecting her life like vultures picking at carrion. She stopped sleeping, began hiding vodka in her water bottle, her breath sour with desperation. I observed her unraveling with clinical detachment. When she begged me to hire a lawyer, I feigned empathy. "We'll fight this," I promised, even as I leaked her private journal entries to a gossip blogger, pages detailing her contempt for Marcus, her mocking descriptions of Lydia's Stepford wife act. The blog post went viral. Lydia filed for divorce, taking the children and half of Marcus's frozen assets. By the time Claire realized the offshore account had been emptied, the $2.3 million rerouted to an NGO prosecuting white-collar crime, she was too fractured to connect the dots. She'd stare at her reflection in the oven's stainless steel, whispering calculations like incantations. "It's not adding up," she'd mutter. I'd hum in agreement, wiping her fingerprints from the wine glasses as she passed out on the couch. The final stroke came on a cloudless Tuesday. I scheduled a donor gala at her firm, ensuring Claire's attendance was mandatory. She wore black, her face gaunt under the chandelier light. As she took the stage to deliver a speech on ethical leadership, the screens behind her flickered. Security footage of her and Marcus in room 814 played on loop, interspersed with wire transfer records. The crowd froze, then erupted. Cameras flashed. Claire stood paralyzed, her mouth a silent "oh" as the CEO lunged the mic. "This is a hoax," he barked, but the damage was irreversible. I left before the police arrived. In the parking garage, I slipped a USB drive into Marcus's abandoned briefcase, a gift for the prosecutors. Then I drove to the airport, boarding a red-eye to Zurich. The cabin lights dimmed. Somewhere below, Claire's world burned. I closed my eyes, savoring the quiet before the storm. Zurich tasted like ash and possibility. I rented a flat overlooking Lake Geneva, its waters shimmering with the cold clarity of a freshly wetted blade. From there, I watched Claire's unraveling unfold in headlines. PR maven charged in $2.3 million embezzlement scheme. Scandal rocks elite firm. CFO and exec face 20 years. Photographs of her perp walk went viral. Her Valentino coat askew, eyes hollowed by flashbulbs. The media dissected her like a specimen, Goldman Sachs alumna. Philanthropist. Fraud. I framed the front page of the Times and hung it beside the window, a perverse trophy. The trial lasted 9 days. Claire's lawyers, paid with the last dregs of her frozen assets, argued coercion, a narrative of Marcus manipulating her fragile psyche. They presented fabricated therapy records, a diagnosis of emotional dependency. It almost worked. Then, the prosecution played the Carlton Suites footage, the audio of her mocking Marcus's wife. The jury recoiled as one. Guilty on all counts. I attended the sentencing disguised as a reporter, thick-framed glasses, a prosthetic nose. Claire didn't recognize me. Prison had sanded her edges raw. Her hair hung limp, her wrists bruised from handcuffs. When the judge declared 7 years, she swayed, gripping the podium like it might anchor her. I caught her, I then just for a heartbeat. Her lips formed my name, soundless. I tipped my notepad in salute. The money, her money, had been laundered through a chain of shell corporations, funneled into a Swiss trust under the name Elias Voigt, my grandmother's maiden name. I bought a vineyard in Tuscany, a 16th century stone villa with iron gates and cellars stocked with Merlot. The locals assumed I was another widowed financier, and I cultivated the lie with care. My hands, once soft from desk work, grew callous pruning vines. I learned to savor the ache of labor, the simplicity of dirt under nails. Claire wrote letters, begging at first, then bargaining, finally raging. "You did this," she scrawled in one, the ink slashing through paper. "I'll find you. I'll make you pay." I burned them in the fireplace, watching her fury curl into smoke. Her parole requests were denied, her appeals dismissed. Marcus hung himself in his cell year 2, a detail I celebrated with a 95 Sassicaia. 5 years in, a hurricane battered the Caribbean. News footage showed the Caymans underwater, power lines snaking through flooded streets. The offshore bank holding Claire's remaining assets collapsed, its records dissolving in salt water. That night, I stood on the villa's terrace, breathing in the storm-scented wind, and laughed until my ribs ached. Last spring, Interpol knocked on my door. 2 agents, crisp and polite, inquiring about Elias Voigt's ties to Veritas Holdings. I served them espresso, chatted about harvest yields, and showed forged land deeds dating back to 1923. They left empty-handed. Afterward, I unearthed the last artifact of my old life, a wedding ring buried in the vineyard soil, and hurled it into the Arno. The river swallowed it without a ripple. Claire died in November. A guard found her slumped in the prison library, a copy of The Great Gatsby splayed on her chest. Heart failure, the report said. Stress-induced. I read the news on a bench in Florence, pigeons pecking at my crumbs. A part of me expected grief, or at least closure. Instead, I felt nothing, a void where hatred once burned. Today, the villa's walls hold no photographs, no relics of vengeance. Just the smell of fermenting grapes and the whisper of cypress trees. Sometimes at dusk, I walk the rows of Sangiovese vines and imagine Claire's voice carried on the wind. Not pleading, not cursing. Just a sigh, dissolving into twilight. I've stopped wondering if she understood. The game was never about her. It was about the man I became in the wreckage, ruthless, precise, finally free. The horizon stretches endlessly here. No shadows. No ghosts. Just the earth, patient and indifferent, teaching me to forget. One story may be ending, but the excitement never stops. Don't wait. Jump right into the next one and keep the thrill alive.